We're going to talk now about a geography to which the Chinese are trying to export much of which we've just been hearing about. Whether it's the authoritarianism and indeed totalitarianism, or whether it's their socialism, communism, whatever you wish to call it, with Chinese characteristics. It is part and parcel of what is being done with this so-called Belt and Road Initiative of Xi Jinping. And I met the other day, thanks to our friend Faith McDonald, with Akol Nyok Akol Dok from South Sudan, who is working hard to try to help his country overcome the effects of jihadism and imperialism from Sudan, Khartoum, but also much of what is being enabled now by the Chinese Communist Party. Akol happens, among other qualities, to have been Mr. Africa International 2016. So we have a handsome specimen here, as well as a leader of the new South Sudan. Akol, please come on up.
Okay, you guys hear me? Okay, thank you for the introduction. As you said, my name is Akol Nyok Akol Dok. I am a graduate of Iowa State University, and I currently live in South Sudan, where I do sort of policy consultant and different work with the business and public sector. Africa. When you think of China, you don't necessarily think of Africa. When you think of United States and Africa, Africa is largely neglected. But there's different Africa that the world doesn't see. The Africa you see may be an Africa of poverty, an Africa of destruction, but there's an Africa of the future. So the future is Africa. Africa will account for more than 54% of the 2.4 billion global population growth in the coming decades. And the UN predicts that between 2015 and 2030, Africa will add 1.3 billion people, doubling its current population. On top of that, Africa remains largely underdeveloped. So its resources, its natural resources, capabilities are all up for grabs. And this is what China is doing. In 2018, President Xi Jinping invited all African heads of state to China, and known as the Beijing Summit Forum on China-African Cooperation. And at this summit, Xi Jinping promised billions of US dollars, up to $100 billion, to support African nations' developmental needs. These needs include infrastructure, economic development, loans. But the catch is that these opportunities have to be done by Chinese companies. The example I give is that my country is currently engaged in a deal with the Chinese, whereas if they're going to build a road about 200 kilometers, and the Chinese will be given 30,000 barrels of oil per day. But the condition is that they have to use a Chinese company, Chinese bank, the Chinese bring in all the manpower, and what do? We get a mediocre road. We don't get training, we don't get capacity, and on top of that, this road is going to collapse and we'll be in debt. So, why is this important? What the Chinese are dominating Africa, and how they're dominating Africa is because the U.S. and Western nations approach. The Chinese play to the narrative that we as the Chinese, we're not like the Westerns, we're not like the Americans, we're not going to intervene into your politics, we're not going to sanction you, we're not going to do this, we're going to work with you, we're going to see you as partners. And so they sell the narrative to African leaders that if you go to the United States, they won't give you money to build roads, to build schools. They'll accuse you of being dictators, human rights abusers, they'll sanction you guys, and we're here. And there's even examples I give where there's some South Sudanese and companies, friends of mine, who say, hey, I want to purchase American equipment to do business in South Sudan. But because there's economic sanctions, I have to go to China. So if you want to buy a new rig is about $15 million. So if I reached out to an American company and said, hey, I want to buy a rig so I can start drilling oil in South Sudan and counter the Chinese, I'll be restricted. But what do? I go to Beijing. So this foreign policy approach is dangerous because what the United States is doing. Yes, there are issues in Africa, but the United States should seek to become partners with Africa to counter China. Because what's happening now is China is offering African nations debts because nobody's knocking at the door except African nation. You're an African president, and your people, they need roads, they need infrastructure, they need hospitals, they want development. And you go to the British, you go to the United States, and They tell you that you have bad human rights records, you need to do this, you need to do that. You don't want to hear that. So what do? You go to China, you go to Beijing, and Beijing says, of course, we'll give you whatever you want to give you. What do you need? Well, I want to build a railroad, such as what's happening in Kenya. They built a railroad from Nairobi to Mombasa port, and they financed it through the Chinese Exim Bank. And these loans are predatory loans. Now, China has seized the international airport of Zambia's capital, Lusaka. China has seized the National Electricity Company. China is even on pace to seize the port of Mombasa because of loans. Why is this important? The Belt and Road Initiative that you hear is actually a way to debt trap African nations. And when they debt trap these nations, they seize their assets. So when you do a Belt and Road Initiative, when you go to 54 African countries and you say, we're going to build you roads, railroads, and infrastructure, we'll give you debts. These could have no choice. And you know for sure that some of these people cannot pay these debts. What's going to happen? China essentially is going to be controlling Africa. And when the U.S. turns its eyes, it's going to be too late because these African nations have signed these agreements. What Africa needs essentially is economic development institution. And it cannot get it from China. Africans, they don't go to China. Me, as an African, I spent time in the United States. I see the values of America and how these values have made America transform and made the West transform. But I don't see a lot of Africans go living in China. You don't find a lot of Africans speaking Chinese. But you find a lot of Africans speaking English. So the recommendation is that the United States needs to do a full review on its policy in Africa and consider China as a threat. China is truly a threat. As we speak right now, in South Sudan, you guys have noticed, the Chinese are building the road. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs building in our country is built by the Chinese. And in the building, you have a flag of China and a flag of South Sudan. This is our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And if you've been to Juba, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is right opposite to the United States Embassy. So you can kind of see the juxtaposition of that. Our president has created a China desk in the office of the president in order to develop relationships. The Chinese are very active in Africa in developing relationships. The Chinese are constantly giving out scholarships, phony scholarships. Many of these students are promised master's degree, bachelor's degree, but they don't get the necessary training that they need. And when they come back to South Sudan or come back to Africa, who's controlling the economy? It's the Chinese. Do you think a Chinese is going to send a Chinese back to China and employ an African? Of course not. And when they come back, as we speak in South Sudan, there are oil field workers who don't know English but only speak Chinese in South Sudan. So when a South Sudanese gets training in China and spends 5 years and comes back and says, I'm ready to work, the Chinese say, well, he's not qualified enough. Why? Because he doesn't speak Chinese. So what is happening is that the Chinese are just having a heyday in Africa, and something needs to be done about it. And this thing is very destructive. So what we want to do is a review of this, and let's see what are ways that the U.S. could partner with countries in Africa to promote economic development and institutions and counter China. Thank you.
Question? Sasha.
Well, I think I can speak.
No, they can't hear you.
Questions that actually involved in a few cases 10 years ago. African unions complained that the Chinese companies in Africa first only in the beginning only hired the workers from China, and they put the workers in the compound and not allowing them to contact African workers. And are they hiring African workers now?
No, on limited scale. And most of the African workers that are hired is through push from the government. But the Chinese themselves, they don't hire African workers. To the point where they bring cooks, drivers, menial labor staff from China to Africa to do some of the work.
This is colonialism.
Yeah, it's colonialism.
Thank you, Akol. Thank you very much. It may be new colonialism, but it's still colonialism. You just heard a moment ago from Sasha Gong. We're going to ask her to come up and introduce our next speaker, Robert Lee. Sasha is a member, again, I'm very pleased to say, of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. She spent quite a number of years after she extricated herself from China, where she was a political prisoner, educated here, and worked in various positions in the Voice of America until she encountered some of the difficulties that Robert is also going to be speaking about in terms of Chinese influence operations inside our own country and indeed our government. Sasha, welcome.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you. Before I'm going to, I will introduce my very dear colleague and good friend, Robert Lee, who actually stole the name of a great Virginian general. And I want to recognize my other very dear friend and colleague, Hu Chenzhang, who served as Guang Cheng's interpreter before. Hu Cheng actually is still working in Voice of America, but he got demoted. He's one of the greatest anchor and greatest journalists in the Chinese-speaking world. Yeah. And, well, it is a very well-known event that on April 19, 2017, I was leading a team to interview a whistleblower from China who want to expose corruption in China. He's a billionaire, high-ranking, operative in a way. And he had a lot of information. The Chinese government already targeted him in the Chinese media for 2 years. So I thought I would be giving him a chance to balance the news. No, the Chinese government, actually the Chinese embassy, the Chinese government, and involved in Interpol to intervene. Guess what happened? Voice of America, well, I worked in, and they demanded to cancel the entire interview, to shut this guy up. And as the leader of that team, I said no. So in the middle of the interview, the top management came to someone, said, you have to pull the plug. It's a live show. Doesn't matter, you pull the plug. That's the guy. He was in charge of the internet operation, but at that time, they came to him and said, well, pull the plug. And he said, no, you have to give me a written order. They refused to give a written order because they did not want to leave any written order. So for that one reason, he got fired 3 weeks ago. I'm very sorry, Robert, but I think God intended you to play a much better role. Come here.
Okay. What an introduction. I'd like to show my thanks to Frank, to the Chairman Kennedy, and to a Committee on the Present Danger China to remember Tiananmen massacre. We want the whole world to know that we'll never forget. Last Friday, Twitter suspended hundreds of accounts. These accounts had a couple of things in common. First of all, the users of the accounts are Chinese, living inside and outside of China. And they tweet using the Chinese language. Second of all, the accounts are all critical of the Chinese government and Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. As for the date of the suspension, last Friday was May 31st, 4 days before June 4th, 2019, the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square massacre. Some have called these suspensions the Twitter massacre. I happen to manage one account which is within the suspended account. That's not my personal account. I manage it on behalf of a group of people. And Twitter explained that they may have made some mistakes in their routine checkup. I just got a Twitter message 40 minutes ago, and there is an explanation. A little background. We have automated systems that find and remove spam accounts, and yours was flagged by our systems as spam by mistake. Reports regarding your account submitted by other users did not play a role in these actions. What a convenient excuse. Think about it. Twitter suspends the accounts of users using Chinese language and being critical of the Chinese government 4 days before the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. The timing is impeccable. Can we really believe that this is simply a coincidence? I must be very naive. If this happened in China, where censorship is the norm, then nothing would be amiss. But this happened here, in the United States of America, the leader of the democratic and free world. That's not normal. That should not be normal. Since when has suppression of freedom of speech become normal here? This is what I want to stress today. We are being attacked from the inside. We're so vulnerable because the attacker is one of our own. And we are being backstabbed. These attackers could be big corporations like Twitter, or high-ranking government officials like the head of the Voice of America, VOA, and Board of Broadcasting Governors. Now it's called the U.S. Agency of Global Media, right? Okay, I'm not familiar with it. I'm still using BBG, who caved in to Chinese pressure and abruptly stopped an interview with Guo Wengui in 2017. That's the incident Sasha just mentioned just now in the introduction. These organizations are our own, and they have a direct impact on our freedom of speech. These incidents have shown that freedom is in imminent danger. Twitter denied that China had any involvement in this massive suspension, just like the Voice of America and BBG denied that Chinese pressure led to the suspension of Guo Wengui's interview. Who wouldn't deny that kind of accusation? But then, why are people, including me, highly suspicious of China's involvement? Because China uses carrot and stick to cast influence here. Thanks to big Western corporations, including most American corporations, the Chinese Communist Party now has enough money to influence many areas of the United States. More than you can imagine. On one occasion, the Chinese business opportunities made someone delivered a letter from Xi Jinping, the president of China, directly into the White House, the top of our administration, asking our president to deport a person the Chinese government wants, Guo Wengui, of course. If you look into any of the projects related to China of all the major think tanks and universities here in the States, you will see Chinese money backing them. China offers all kinds of incentives, business opportunities, donations, investment, access to vast resources for research, etc., etc. You name it. We know that power corrupts. We also know that money corrupts too. And with so much money at its disposal, China has developed a record of successfully influencing American decisions. Ordinary Chinese citizens could be thrown into jail for having a Twitter account. But all major state-owned Chinese media outlets have a huge presence on Twitter. CCTV has nearly 8 million followers on Twitter. Xinhua has 23 million followers, even more. People's Daily has nearly 5 million, and China Daily, that's an English newspaper by China, has nearly 2 million. These accounts are ultimately controlled by the propaganda development of the Chinese Communist Party, and they have clearly built a strong presence on an American social media platform. But I guess Twitter has never accidentally suspended those accounts. Hudson Institute, a conservative think tank, claimed that it was the only think tank that didn't take Chinese money. Good for it, despite the fact that its China experts, fellows, and researchers visited China and cooperated with Chinese counterparts on research projects. In October 2017, Hudson Institute scheduled an event called A Conversation with Guo Wengui on October 4th, 2017, 5 months after VOA cut off its interview with Guo Wengui. One day before the event, they announced that the event was postponed and would be rescheduled. From my research, before the scheduled event, Hudson Institute's website was hacked, possibly by Chinese attackers. The institute got messages from China that the status of visas for its fellows and researchers could be endangered if the event was to go on as scheduled. I heard that at least one of the institute's donors took a donation from a Chinese donor and passed that donation to the Hudson Institute. Bingo. That donor demanded the event be cancelled. Now, that carrot, in the form of a donation, turned into a stick. I wish this wasn't true, but the event has been postponed for over 18 months. Never rescheduled. That's really a long postponement. When they reschedule the event, if there is such a time ever, I'd like to receive an invitation again, just like I did in 2017. It is not that I'm so interested in the event, but I really hope they honor their words and prove there is really no Chinese money influencing the so-called postponement. By the way, the head of Hudson Institute also happens to be the head of BBG, the agency that was ultimately responsible for the cancellation of VOA's interview with Guo Wengui. Another convenient coincidence. Why do I keep coming back to these U.S. international broadcasting organizations, BBG and VOA? American taxpayers spend about $700 million annually to fund organizations such as BBG and VOA. And these organizations are supposed to promote American policies and exemplify principles of a free press and freedom of speech. Now, how has the Chinese carrot influenced the BBG's decisions? I can't be sure. But some vulnerabilities are worth paying attention to. In 2011, The Chinese edition of Steve Jobs' biography was published in China. It was published, I think, in the same year here, and became a bestseller immediately. The concern is the writer of this book was the BBG board chairman at the time. Since 1994, Hollywood has made billions of dollars from exporting movies to China. Now, Chinese money is funding some of the Hollywood's movies. This is the normal business, right? There's only one concern. During 2010 and 2012, the chairman and CEO of Sony Pictures Entertainment, which also owns the Columbia Pictures, was at the same time the interim presiding governor of BBG. Today, a top executive of VOA has a huge family business operation in China. At this very moment. Now, I'm not saying that these top executives have done anything wrong. However, when they face tough decisions about China, can they guarantee that the business benefits that they personally receive from China won't factor in? These are huge conflicts of interest, and we taxpayers can suffer because of them. I always say to evaluate people, you not only listen what they say, you pay more attention to what they do. Every 1 or 2 years, there is a survey of best places to work in federal government, an evaluation given by the federal employees for their own agencies. For years, out of 27 mid-sized federal agencies, BBG has always stayed in the lower quartile. Actually, for quite a few years, BBG was number 1 from the bottom. Out of 415 agency subcomponents, VOA, like its mother agency, has stayed in the lower quartile too, forever. The upper management of VOA rarely gives the director instructions to Mandarin service on what programs to do. Here are a few programs that the top executives of VOA instructed the Mandarin service to produce. The ivory smuggling in Africa. Talk to admissions officers of major U.S. colleges and universities. What major issues come to your mind when you think of China? Don't you think of the South China Sea, the Taiwan issue, cyber attacks, the trade war, human rights abuse, religious persecutions? Why would college admissions be more important than any of those issues when it comes to reporting on China? The top executives of VOA and BBG just don't get it. So, what is the solution? Yes, it's high time we fixed our own problems. So we need to clean our house. We need to eliminate the danger within before we can fight outside forces effectively. What can we do to prevent public platforms like Twitter from wrongdoing, such as the Twitter massacre? I don't have a well-thought solution. Maybe we need to have new laws or amend the old laws to regulate these platforms, so freedom of speech and freedom of press can really be practiced without being influenced by China's carrot and stick or anyone else. As for BBG and VOA, the U.S. international broadcasting agencies, we need a total overhaul. If necessary, eliminate them completely and build a new agency. In any case, change must start with a comprehensive overhaul of leadership, as Secretary of State Pompeo suggested to the Congress. We need to locate and hire the leaders with clear and sound international visions, knowledge of American interests and values, and the ability to advance those interests and values around the world with no personal or business interests with China and other current or potential adversaries. Without the complete overhaul of leadership, other structural change won't work. Simply put, we need a few good men and women too. God bless America. Thank you.
Quick question. Does anyone have a question for Robert Lee very quickly? Yes, sir, right here.
Yeah, I basically have two questions.
Just one question, sir.
Oh, okay. So I think we should have a congressional hearing on the Twitter. It's very important. Congress paid a lot of money for the Twitter's revenue.
I totally agree. I think we need to work on legislation to have rules set. So those corporations have to abide by our values of freedom of speech, freedom of press, human rights, and democracy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robert, very much. Well, at each of our programs to this point, we have had a focus on a particularly important public policy issue. And I'm very pleased to say this will be no exception to that. It is the 5G competition with China. And for those of you who've been tracking these issues, we want to make sure that you check out the really remarkable array of insights and assessments of both the stakes involved and the way ahead that has been provided by our previous speakers. You can find the videos at presentdangerchina.org. Today we have the privilege of being addressed by a man who has been working in this space and, among others, on strategic technologies as an investor, seeking to try to help our country compete successfully against China and ensure that we actually prevail, as President Trump has indicated he's committed to doing, in this very high-stakes competition. His name is Andrew Whitney. He is the CEO of Energy Investment Partners. Welcome, Andrew.
Hello, everyone. It's terrific to be here. Very grateful to Frank and to Brian, obviously, for the opportunity to talk to you all. I've got a fairly broad task here, which is to try and explain where I think we need to go in this 5G space. But to do that, I think it's really important to establish a baseline of knowledge so that people actually understand the actual significance of this 5G thing. Because what you tend to hear about is a lot of kind of doom and gloom and disaster, and I think it would be a lot easier for people to understand the severity of all this and also the types of decisions we need to make if people had a better understanding of the core issues. So I'm going to talk about kind of background, baseline, what is 5G, because nobody ever really defines that when they talk about it, what the threat is, what the problem is, what I think the solution is, and then what we need in order to get to that solution. 5G can be a tremendous asset. It will be a tremendous asset if it's done correctly. It'll be a great resource for opportunity, quality of life. But in order to realize that benefit, it means not giving it away, giving the future away to networks powered by Chinese equipment. So today I want to cover some core concepts, a little bit of a kind of a decent grounding in all this, and address a communications issue, literally and figuratively, about 5G, because I think you can't expect to understand something that you don't understand the fundamental elements of. So, so there's that. We're going to talk about the scale of the threat, and we're going to talk about some good news, which I think is a big win for America, allies, and the free world. But we do need decisions. We have to make decisions. The good news is the technology, the finance, and the commercial model is now there, but we have to make decisions. So the baseline here is that you have to make these technologies accessible to people, otherwise they can't possibly make any decisions about them. As Frank said in the introduction, I'm a private equity guy, I'm a technology investor. It's my job to work with really smart technology innovators and make those ideas turn into a commercial reality that's actually functional, viable, works. So that's kind of what I do. And in order to do my job, I have to be fluent in all those dialects of technical, language, if you will. You might call it a dialect of geek, dork, and nerd. You have to be able to speak all these different languages and translate that into something that kind of makes sense to normal people like us. And then also the other thing I want to stress here is that contrary to your typical sort of socialist narrative, as a conservative and a free market capitalist, I'm all about solutions that consider people and ecology and all those other things. The left has done a tremendous job of painting us all into this corner of just being generally bad people. That's not the case. So let's talk very quickly about what is 5G, because if you don't understand this, you've got no hope of understanding the real scale of the problem here. And conservatives, unfortunately, are pretty bad when it comes to understanding a lot of technology concepts. There's lots of people who can't even work email still. It's remarkable. And we've got to pick up a game on that, otherwise, we'll get beaten every time. The problem you have with 5G is you'll hear lots and lots of buzzwords all the time, things that you don't understand at all, and then you'll basically let the whole thing wash over you because you're kind of lost at the beginning. You'll hear about peak data rate, user experience data rate, latency. You'll hear about that all the time. Network energy efficiency, mobility, connection density, all these things, and it's just kind of flying over your head, and at this point you glaze over. In practical terms, what does 5G really mean? It's things like enhanced mobile virtual reality and augmented reality. That's not just about playing Pokemon Go. It's about the type of functionality where, as I'm standing here explaining a frequency spectrum, as you look at me, if you held up a device or you were wearing a pair of glasses, you would see a representation floating in front of my face of where all the parts of the spectrum are, and this is additional information that's augmenting your experience of reality. You can do that with 5G. It's things like being able to use combinations of different types of wireless technologies to serve underserved or unserved areas, rural areas, things like that. You can interlace all that stuff when you're talking about 5G technology. It's about ultra reliable, low latency communications. Now again, that sounds like a real mouthful. Why does that matter? Well, it's nice to have nice, clean, clear communication, but it means you can have things like factory automation or remote surgery. Latency is lag, basically. So you can perform an operation at a distance using a robot with zero lag between your inputs and the cutting surface. It's remarkable stuff, but it's only possible with 5G. Enhanced V2X, that's vehicles to anything. Vehicles to pedestrians, vehicles to infrastructure, things in the way, stuff going on, inputs constantly between vehicles, including flying ones. You won't be able to have any flying vehicles until you've got all this kind of communication going on between the vehicle itself and the surroundings and the occupants. You can do that with 5G. And then, of course, the one that everybody hears about, which is massive Internet of Things. So sensors everywhere, sensors all over the place. Networks, smartphones, buildings, smart cities, precision agriculture, sensors everywhere. You can only process that in a 5G environment. So it's a lot more than just, bigger, faster downloads of movies and games. That's the kind of narrative that's pushed at the consumer because they think that's the only thing the consumer's interested in, so that's all you tend to hear about. But 5G, to be clear, it has the power to determine economic success and failure. There is no overstatement of the case. If you doubt that, consider that there are 500,000 counterfeit retailers on Amazon right now that copy the real owner of a business or a piece of IP, clone the product, and put the price up there 1 cent lower. So the pricing algorithm in Amazon shows that product top of the list, and that's the one you buy because it was top of the list and it was cheapest. That's happening in real time on Amazon already. Now, if you use 5G to look at the inventory levels in any given region or market in the moment, you can adjust your pricing and destroy anyone else in that space. This is immensely significant. But more than that, it controls power over life and death. And I want you to remember that point, because we're going to come back to that. So what are the challenges of 5G? It's basically about management of spectrum, of data and compute, and cost. That's really what it boils down to. Health is not an issue. I can explain that if anyone wants to see me afterwards, but health is not an issue with 5G, even though there's been a narrative push that it is. Very quickly, on the subject of spectrum management, you have to understand the difference between wavelength and frequency. So wavelength is the length of a sine wave. Frequency is how often that effectively occurs in a given period of time. Why does this matter? Essentially, the longer wavelength you've got, the further it will travel, but the less carrying capacity it has. The higher the frequency you've got, the more carrying capacity it has, but it won't go so far, and it requires a lot more energy to push it. So this means that essentially what you want is the best of both worlds. You want to be in the middle of that spectrum. Well, the issue is that everywhere else in the world, that is where the 5G battle is occurring. But that part of the spectrum, and we're using some simplifications here for expediency, but that part of the spectrum in the US is currently controlled by the Department of Defense. So there's some debate about using a completely different part of the spectrum called millimeter wave. But millimeter wave is much higher frequency. It involves a lot more power use. It involves a lot more frequent towers and implementations, which drives up your network infrastructure cost. So for all of those things, there are issues there. That's just the spectrum piece. So what's the threat? Well, it starts because the way licenses are currently apportioned in effectively every major market is they end up going out to a bid process where the usual suspects come along and they bid up the value of these licenses, and then they get that spectrum. And what that typically results in is you have whole rural areas completely underserved, because obviously to recover that investment in license, the investors focus all their efforts on regional, kind of urban, dense markets where they can recover the most revenue. It means that the prices tend to stay high because it's the same people bidding for the licenses all the time. It means that spectrum's underutilized because they tend to focus it all on certain markets where they'll get the best bang for the buck. And it also means the same operators end up rushing into the welcoming arms of the Chinese, who provide very low-cost network infrastructure equipment. So if you've paid through the nose for the spectrum, then all that's left in your cash kitty is very limited amount of money to pay for your network infrastructure. So the Chinese are exploiting this approach to spectrum provision by providing a product that neatly fits into everybody's available budget. Why would China go to such lengths to do that? Why would you provide such massive subsidy? Well, it's because they understand that the power of these networks and the data is enormous. It will bestow a power more complete and fungible than any weapon system ever deployed on this planet. You can contextualize this as like in the Marvel Avengers universe, as basically saying it's like Thanos with all 5 Infinity Stones. Basically, it's control over everything. It will allow you to annihilate anybody's commercial position, marginalize anybody's military forces in a given theatre, negate somebody's popular support, and basically crash all of your cars, pacemakers and supply chains. You can do that kind of thing with 5G technology. So I'm not joking when I say it is power over economic futures and even life and death. This is all real. I can walk you through the examples if you want to have them afterwards. I'm just trying to get through some of this stuff. So if you gave me a choice between domination of 5G and unlimited nuclear missiles and other weapons, I'll take 5G all day long. China is a totalitarian communist government that has somewhere between 1 and 3 million people in actual concentration camps, and you can't give those people control of this. They've made it clear they will stop at nothing and see all means as legitimate, including targeting families far in the rear of the battlefield. I mean, this is a Chinese military doctrine book that you've probably all read, Unrestricted Warfare. It makes it absolutely clear that they consider that a legitimate means of warfare. 5G is simply the best tool they could ever have hoped for, and they will not hesitate to use it. These are the same guys from the Great Leap and Tiananmen Square and the one-child policy that we've heard about. They cannot be allowed to dominate 5G. America must have its own secure 5G solution and provide alternative leadership for the free world. The good news is I'm pleased to say that we now can. So if we recap the challenge, it's management of spectrum, data and compute, and cost. You've been told they've got us beat, that we don't even have the technical capability or the skills anymore after years of offshoring, and that we will never muster the capital to roll this out. What if I told you we do in fact have the technology to do this with superior computation power and energy efficiency, and with a totally secure US supply chain and completely cyber and EMP hardened? We actually have that. The spectrum's there. We also have what we believe is a very workable business model for all stakeholders. It's a private sector solution. It includes everybody, including the ignored rural folk, reduces costs, and it drives huge benefit for the US economy. What do we need? Timely decisions, not ruled by committee. We need more widespread understanding of what's at stake here, because people don't understand the things that I've just explained to you. They can't possibly understand the severity. And we need more of the same excellent, bold leadership that the White House has been showing with things like the executive orders on secure supply chain and resilience. So it's about decisions and communications. Thanks.
Sure. Question?
Quick question. I was made aware recently that the UK has been having some internal debate about whether or not to use the Chinese firm Huawei for their infrastructure, and that defense people do not want to use it, but Theresa May was overriding them. Now, she's about to be gone, but apparently one guy was even fired for coming out and spilling the beans on it. Do you know anything about that situation?
So,
and whether our intelligence people are concerned if they can work with them and share intelligence?
Are you picking on me because I've got a funny accent? No, it's a good question actually, and it's a terrible thing. Obviously, for the Chinese, picking off the Five Eyes as they're known is a tremendous coup, and Theresa May has apparently gone off on a particular tangent in that regard, because the security services over there are quite vehement that they want nothing to do with it. They said the same thing about the Chinese-backed plan to build a nuclear power plant called Hinkley C. And part of the deal there, orchestrated by the former Prime Minister David Cameron, was that Chinese money would come in and provide the capital for this, somewhere in the region of sort of 35 to 50 billion pounds, and the Chinese would get complete control of another nuclear reactor site. And MI5 came out and said, this is absolute madness, this cannot happen. And it turned into a big tussle. So the same thing has happened on this 5G thing. Thankfully, the people voted with their feet in a recent election. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, will be considering alternative career options now, and not a moment too soon. I'm just really glad I'm an American, frankly, but we can save them because we've got a great solution now. So your question's a very good one. We have an all US secure supply chain solution that will absolutely be a great opportunity for all of America's allies to kind of jump on board with and provide a real alternative to that. Because that's how they're getting in. They're getting in because they're exploiting a cost-driven strategy, and they're the only opportunity in the room. So as our colleague from South Sudan has said, you can't beat something with nothing. If nobody else is there saying, hey, we've got this, then what are they to do? So I hope that answers your question.
Good. Adequately.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
I think the good news is that President Trump is over there speaking with Her Majesty's government as we speak. And I have the feeling that the costs to Britain for the special relationship, in particular the intelligence sharing piece of it, will be a very important argument against going down that road. So stay tuned. We've had a sneak preview in Liang Che's comments about the U.S. underwriting many of the horrible things we've been talking about emanating from communist China at the moment. I'm very pleased to have my colleague and friend Roger Robinson, former senior director for international economic affairs at the Reagan National Security Council, one of the men who helped President Reagan translate the 1970s version of the Committee on the Present Danger into a strategy for taking down the USSR. And we're pleased to have him come back to talk a little bit more about a case study of how American investors are unwittingly enabling the sort of police state apparatus that Lan Chao also talked about, and talked to us about Hick Vision. Roger Robinson. He is these days, among other things, chairing the Prague Security Studies Institute, and I believe it's in that capacity that you're here.
I am. And what's our timetable? About 15 minutes. Excellent. Try to observe it for once. Well, it's as always, a privilege to have a chance to speak to you today. As Frank knows, and the committee has rather fulsomely explored this rather new topic of the Chinese corporate presence in the U.S. capital markets. And to the surprise of many, we're not talking about small change. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of oftentimes high risk, what folks would, I think, immediately conclude are Chinese bad actors from the perspective of national security and human rights abuses that have successfully entered our markets, and in so doing, the portfolios of average Americans, including those in the room. Now, it's not just a few Americans. I don't know how many Americans total are in the markets, maybe 180, 200 million if I took a rough guess. So we're talking about the bulk of the population of the United States. And as you may also guess, not having heard much about this subject, if anything, in the past, it should tell you that there's been no security-minded or human rights-minded screening mechanism ever put up over the capital markets of the United States, despite the fact that our markets are roughly the size of the rest of the world's combined. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if China has $1 trillion in exposure in our markets. It's a very difficult subject to research. We've been at it for a couple of years, and I feel that even now we're just at the biopsy stage of trying to understand this pathology. Because make no mistake, these are not necessarily benign entities. They are ones that we would be concerned about. For example, we talked about Hick Vision. Obviously, they are one of the world's, if not the world's, leading provider of surveillance cameras that are littering the tops of the walls of the concentration camps housing 1, 2, or more million Uyghurs. This is something I'd like to come back to because we are finally getting action in that portfolio, having highlighted the fact that Americans are unwittingly aiding and abetting the concentration camp business, which is something that I think we'd all be loath to see as using our hard-earned investment dollars, whether our retirement systems or one of other many funds, from index funds to exchange-traded funds, mutual funds. It's a long list. And it's faceless fund managers that we all, myself included, turn our funds over and hope that they'll do the right thing. Well, they may be going for return, but they're not going for values, and they're not going for moral compass. That's what I'll assure you of today. Illustrations. China Unicom. Sounds benign enough. Listed on the New York Stock Exchange, no less. A serial PLA contractor. They provide the telecom services to the Chinese military in the South China Sea, including its signal intelligence facilities. They provide North Korea with its only internet service. That should tell you something. They are the entity that provided the wherewithal for the PLA's most aggressive cyber attack unit, APT-1, to hack into hundreds of American companies and steal our competitive information so that their state-owned enterprises of China would be able to be even more assured than they already are of taking these contracts. So that is a small profile of MSCI, and we're still, they're in the MSCI Emerging Market Index. I was meant Hike Vision now we're talking about. Besides being on the New York Stock Exchange, it's also in the MSCI Emerging Market Index. That index is tracked by $16 trillion of funds under management. So when a Chinese company is added to an index fund, automatically that $16 trillion buys that stock. Now, think of the windfall for China. And think of the fact that that company goes into every otherwise healthy cell of the American body politic. That's what you call going viral, instantly. And they're not alone in the MSCI. If you look at other entities that have found this promised land for China, this very efficient way of entering the portfolios of the American people in one shot, look at other participants. AVIC Aircraft. That sounds innocent enough. What do? Well, they produce a range of fighter aircraft and unmanned aerial vehicles. They're responsible for China's anti-ship missiles deployed in the South China Sea. They've been sanctioned several times, but you're not going to read about that in the prospectus that they're submitting to the SEC, supposedly recording material risks so that all of us are properly informed before we make an investment decision. You don't see these types of profiles appear there, despite, again, the materiality of that risk to share value and corporate reputation. I mean, even if we put moral compass and our national security concerns aside, we still have the fact that these are fundamental market violations where all of us need to disclose our risks properly, and yet the Chinese get a free pass in not doing so. More recently, AVIC has provided Iran's new ground-based anti-ship cruise missiles, which may be readied as we speak to use against American naval forces in the Sixth Fleet and beyond. Moving on, China's shipbuilding. They just build commercial ships, right? Well, think again. Guided missile destroyers, they build nuclear ballistic missile submarines. They're the ones that are targeting our cities. They're the ones that are targeting your families. And they're the ones that are benefiting from your investment dollars, as in the people in this room, much less our fellow Americans. Has this issue ever seen the light of day? Do you recall anybody talking about this on Capitol Hill, in the executive branch, in the media, in a cocktail party? You'd think that somebody would have said something by now, but they didn't, did they? Now, I'm talking about empirical facts here. I'm not talking about my opinion versus yours on something like missile defense. So this should tell you something else. It tells you that the very fact that we don't know about this and that we're focused almost single-mindedly on U.S.-China trade, as important as it is, because this is where they live and die. This is the money. This was the money with the Soviet Union. That's what we went after. We went after their hard currency cash flow. We went after their escape valves in Western governments and banks providing those credits. They'd be up today if Ronald Reagan had not put clamps on every one of the life support tubes that we were providing. And guess what? Here we go again. Now, Hikvision, I'll conclude by saying, it could be a success story. This issue has been out there for a while. The human rights community, our friends at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and others, have been alert to this for a long time, that they were aiding and abetting these concentration camps and the fate of this massive number of people that you can see from space. Well, but it's hard to give it expression. It's hard to get critical mass attention, much less action. Well, we've made a breakthrough there, which is we're now able to look at publicly traded Chinese companies with a presence in our capital markets who are providing the wherewithal for that facial recognition technology, for those very surveillance cameras that keep them tucked away behind razor wire. Now, this is out there. And Victims of Communism and others have made it so. Now we're hearing that Hikvision may be being readied for the entity list of the Department of Commerce, where you need a license to supply any components. I mean, this could be a major problem for Hikvision, to say the least. You see what's happened to Huawei. You saw what happened to ZTE before that. And I think, with any luck, Hikvision is going to hit the wall on that entity list, remembering that their parent company has already been put on the entity list because they're, big surprise, a national security violator. Can we have more Hikvisions? Can we bring recognition to this issue once and for all? And the answer is yes, we can. We have the power to do this. This is our money. We have a right to hold Wall Street accountable. We have a duty to do so. And finally, we can give expressions to our most coveted values, both national security and human rights. Thank you very much.
Roger, I just want to take the liberty to ask you to specifically address one question that you've talked about more elsewhere than I think you did here. And that is the disparity between the way these companies from China are being treated by our Securities and Exchange Commission relative to how they treat our own companies. Would you just talk about that as another place where we need to make changes?
Sure. This gets down to disclosure and accountability. And that's why those remedies can serve us so well in this case. Namely, in the U.S., or a West European company, or any of those of our allies, face a rigorous test when they come to the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, even to a lesser extent, our over-the-counter market. That the disclosure is fundamental, as is risk management. You're supposed to record any material risk to share value and corporate reputation, and if you don't, it's called by the SEC a material omission, which is legally actionable. So it's against the law. I mean, let's be clear, this is not a small thing. And yet, whereas we will go after an American company for a material omission, but China doesn't write any of this down. They don't tell you that they're in the South China Sea. They don't tell you that they're underwriting North Korean nuclear and missile capabilities. They don't tell you that they've been sanctioned before. They don't tell you that their employees have been arrested for espionage. Where's that in the risk section? And isn't that material to my decision as to whether or not to buy the stock? They can be sanctioned. I mean, even if you put our values aside, what about share value? What's going to happen to their corporate reputation when they show up in the front page of the Wall Street Journal or something of that kind? So this is actually, ironically, evening the playing field. This is preferential treatment. Now, imagine the irony. I mean, how sickening an affair this really is.
One more question from the audience. Anybody?
Yes.
Let's get
Are you up to
right here, Peter.
Roger, what's preventing the SEC from doing its job?
Well, in part, the SEC has never been confronted with the notion that should be obvious to all of us and every American, which is the materiality of national security abuses in your background or in your network of subsidiaries, not to mention human rights abuses like are taking place in Tibet and vis-a-vis the Uyghurs. So these are not acknowledged to be material risk categories. How convenient. You know, how lovely for Beijing that we just kind of give that one a miss, don't we? We're interested in corruption and we're interested in a number of other things, but these two categories don't seem to make the cut. And that's what we're able to change, and that's where we should be headed.
Thank you. Finally, I'm very pleased to say we have with us one of the men who helped inspire the Committee on the Present Danger of China, who has been very active with the committee and particularly has participated brilliantly in a number of the previous threat briefings that we've done here. In fact, I was very anxious to have him come back and reprise a message that he imparted to some of the people Roger was just talking about on Wall Street in one of the programs that we did up there about a month or so ago about freedom and what's really on the line at the moment now with Communist China and its efforts to deprive really the freedom of the world. His name, of course, is Steve Bannon. He has just blown in from Europe, where he was working to prop up freedom over there. We're very grateful to him for that. And he is, of course, a former strategic advisor to President Trump and chairman of a great news organization, Breitbart, and member of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. That's a reason I wanted to get back here today was to give you a report from the front. You know, I think the last time I saw you folks was the last week of April. And historic, Frank, I think you underplayed it with Roger Robinson and Cal Bass and the team. A historic Committee on the Present Danger briefing at the St. Regis Hotel in Midtown Manhattan about finance, Wall Street, capital, and how it's created this Frankenstein monster, which is the radical cadre, the CCP, that controls China. I've had the opportunity since we last talked to go to Norway, Berlin, Italy, France, London, and Kazakhstan. And here's what's fascinating. People have actually started to see the videos that we've been doing. People are actually starting to understand what's going on. In every capital I was in, and I was over there principally for the European parliamentary elections, but in every capital where I would meet with business leaders, political activists, people in the populist movement, people in the sovereignty movement, some people who are in government today, and particularly financial people. We are at an inflection point because the world is starting to awaken that something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. And the reason it went terribly wrong is because of us. It is our capital, our technology, our elites that have imposed this on the Chinese people. This is not about the United States versus China. This is not about the industrial democracies versus China. The Chinese people are among the most noble, hardworking, family-oriented, terrific people on the face of the planet. And their history of when they're allowed to have freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of assembly and property rights and the rule of law is unparalleled, second to none, in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, in Southeast Asia and Singapore, in London, and in the United States of America. It was driven home to me actually in Berlin. I was talking about, I was making an analysis, doing an analysis and a presentation about Made in China 2025. As you all know, the three prongs of the geopolitical tsunami that is hitting us from Beijing, from President Xi and Wan Qishan, is One Belt, One Road, Made in China 2025, and Huawei's 5G rollout. Game, set, match. The most extraordinary, ambitious, audacious geopolitical roll-up in mankind's history. Even if you give the benefit of the doubt, which I do not, but let's for a second do it, to the elites, to the Henry Kissinger and Graham Allison and that crowd, the Thucydides trap, which, by the way, is inculcated in all the elites when you go around and talk to them, whether it's in Paris or in Berlin or in London. In the 16 examples, I say, it's interesting. You talk about, rising powers, declining powers, Peloponnesian War, Athens, Sparta. There's not one example where the so-called rising power was financed by the elites of the declining power. What happened to us? Look at the people of China. Across a broad section. Uyghurs, Falun Gong, Dalai Lama, the Tibetan Buddhists, the underground evangelical Christian church, the underground Catholic church, and the basic citizens of China, day in and day out, in a totalitarian surveillance state. Completely with no property rights, no freedom of speech, no religious rights, a totalitarian state that the elites of the West financed and basically gave the technology and the equipment to. NPR had a great report a couple of weeks ago. I think it was 500 companies. There was 500 companies that they had gone to the files, had all somehow gone to I think it was the Treasury Department, Department of Commerce, and complained about not just forced technology transfer, but cyber intrusions, technology theft, forced technology transfers, all there. The reporter, no right-winger, not from Breitbart, from National Public Radio, went around. Every executive said, it's terrible. We're getting crushed. Not one executive would go on camera, would be interviewed, would give their name, etc., for fear. In Germany, it hit me in the solar plexus. Somebody sat there and said, Merkel and this crowd, and the Davos crowd, and the guys in Brussels are exactly like Hillary Clinton and the elites in the United States. They lost confidence in themselves. They lost faith in themselves. They actually believed that we are the declining power and that they're the rising power. And who's going to pay for that? Who's first paying for it is the Chinese people. It's upon their shoulders that this burden has been foisted. The great part about this committee and what we've been doing, the work, is it's off the shoulders of who's the closest equivalent to old 100 names. And that's the deplorables. If it wasn't in the summer and in the fall of 2016, we wouldn't be here. This would not have happened. Because the deplorables found an instrument. Donald Trump. And that instrument, as you can see in England today, is an armor in all of its imperfections, is an armor-piercing shell. But it's the deplorables that said, I don't understand all this high finance, and I don't understand all this, mumbo jumbo, but here's what I do understand. The factories left, the jobs left with them, and the opioids came. If you go to Germany, they understand that Made in China 2025 is absolutely targeted to, was it the Mittelstand? The private companies are the backbone of German society that employed the deplorables of Germany. Aimed right at them. The robotics and the precision engineering, it's coming right at them. They no longer can hide, and their elites have allowed this to happen. The great point of this inflection point, it's totally anti-elite how we got here. This is true populism. This is true, the grit and determination. The only way that we're going to take down this radical cadre, the CCP, is old 100 names. When finally they've had enough of it, and finally they understand that we in the West are going to hold our elites accountable. We're not going to do this anymore. You've seen the work of Roger Robinson. You've seen the work of different members in the committee. And now people are all shocked. They can't believe there's been gambling going on in this establishment, right? Here's your winnings. But from Kazakhstan to Berlin to Paris to Italy to London to Bergen, Norway, when I show up, they want to talk about populism. They want to talk about this sovereignty movement. They want to talk about nationalism. But you know what they really want to talk about first? They want to talk about China. It permeates everything. It is the central issue of our time. And the central issue, the core issue, is how we took the great values of the West and looked the other way for money. My favorite publication, the New York Times, today on its page 1, right hand, has the brutal expose of a member of the cabinet, Elaine Chao, a Harvard graduate, I might add Harvard Business School, based upon the work, part of the work of Peter Schweitzer, I'm very proud to say, and the Government Accountability Institute. This work came from many years ago. Remember, we did Clinton Cash. Took years to do that, to expose the Clintons. Bernie Sanders and other Democrats wanted to touch it. Bernie had a pillow fight during that the primary. Wouldn't touch it. Mention it every now and again, wouldn't touch it. The Trump campaign, we went right at it for corruption. When Peter and the team finished, this is back in 2014, he said they thought, what should we do next? How about Chinese influence peddling in this city? And it was Peter's team that came up with the two examples. We're going to do we're going to do Republicans and Democrats. This is where they say there's no bipartisanship. When it comes to taking Chinese money, they're bipartisan. But Elaine Chao and McConnell, if you read the book, and there's a lot of questions to be answered, and I'm sure they're going to be answered. But what's most shocking is Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden is running for president of the United States, and last time I looked, he's 32 points ahead in the Democratic primary, right? 23 points here, 32 points here. I think if you look at some of these individual states now, they're putting out the polls, he's matching up or actually beating President Trump in some of the core states that we have to win. You know, I'm waiting for the New York Times. I noticed they started with the Republican on the bipartisan part, right? I'm just waiting for the paper of record, because these are actually, I know some of these are great reporters, to do the Democrat. But Joe Biden is going to have to answer some basic questions before he is even eligible to think about being president of the United States. He's got to answer not just to the people in the United States, he's got to answer to the Chinese people why he took 1.5, or his family took $1.5 billion in a private equity fund to invest, and then why they invested that money in these surveillance companies. We have to know how he's been compromised. We have to know how much money they took. We have to know, we got to see the documents that they pitched. We have to go back to the beginning. His son is totally and completely incompetent to run a private equity firm. You guys know how hard it is to raise that kind of money, the track record you have to have, the years of experience. And what was Biden over there in 2013? What he was over there for? The Munich of the 21st century is those islands in the South China Sea. They're going to cause more problems for Asian people in Korea, in Taiwan, in Singapore, in Japan. Those are stationary aircraft carriers. They allow the radical cadre of the CCP to say, this is a territorial sea, this is ours. Biden went over there, and Biden looked the other way. And Biden looked the other way in that entire time frame when they took hard cash from the Chinese Communist Party, the Bank of China. Remember, the Bank of China, unlike other G20 countries, is not independent. It reports not to the state, it reports to the Chinese Communist Party. I know we got a time limit. I got a bolt, but here's what I want to tell you. The work that we're doing here is incredibly, incredibly important, and people that matter are looking at this now. Major publications, every day there's another expose. Every day they're asking questions like Roger Robinson just asked. Why are there different reporting requirements? Why can't you see the accounting papers? Look at these bankruptcies. Look at this bank that failed the other day, the regional bank in China. The other one's on the watch list. What was it, 25? I think it's 20 have not reported latent reporting. Wait till those dominoes start falling. Let's talk about the World Bank. Let's go into the World Bank and find out what they're doing to finance China. This is an outrage. And here's why it's an outrage. It's an outrage that we in this city, in Wall Street, in the city of London, in Frankfurt, can fully understand what's happening to the Chinese people. They all know what's happening to the Uyghurs. They all know what's happening to the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan Buddhists. They all know what's happening to Falun Gong. They all know what's happening to the underground Christian and Catholic Church. They understand the surveillance, totalitarian dictatorship of what it's doing to the Chinese people. Everybody knows. You can't hide anymore. And yet, they still want to finance it. They still want to provide the technology for it because they want to make a buck. We have to stop that. We have to hold ourselves accountable. This was not Xi. This was not Wan Xishan. This was us. We did this. That Frankenstein monster is our responsibility. We have a fiduciary. And I like the way that Roger Robinson used underwriting. We have a fiduciary responsibility to unwind this. This is not about trade. This is not about soybeans. This is not about steel. This is the highest moral imperative we have. Now, I don't want to hear people say, oh, in the 1930s this, 1930s that. That was horrible. That's then. This is now. We see this. We're going to have to live with this. 100 years from now, they're going to accuse us. And that's why I'm so proud to work with you guys. Our work's just started, but I'm telling you it's getting traction. And here's what. The rats are leaving the ship, and they know they can't hide anymore. Thank you very much.
As I call Brian Kennedy up, I just wanted to say a salute to Steve Bannon on his way out the door. The quick, succinct takeaway from all of this, I think, is something he said in New York. We live in a sort of homage to Abraham Lincoln, a global house divided, half free and half slave. And the people who are enslaving the part that is unfree are the Chinese Communist Party. And the people who are enabling them to do that are us. I'm going to close out my part of this by just saying thank you to you all for being here, for staying, as well as for joining us via the live stream and video. Let me reintroduce my colleague and friend, Brian Kennedy, Chairman of the committee.
Thank you, Frank. And let me just add my thanks for everyone who is here with us today and everybody who's online. I thought Steve Bannon was great, and I really just wanted to answer his question. He asked, how is it possible that we've gotten to the point where we're financing China in their efforts to destroy the United States? And I think I'd answer by saying that we no longer believe in the virtues of our civilization. We no longer believe in what is good about America. That American elites have spent 100 years telling us that we were a bad people, that our history is deficient, that our principles are inadequate. And I believe one reason Donald Trump was elected was because Americans don't buy that. They believe we have a good country. We believe in the principles of human equality. It has been the efforts of this country that has provided more freedom and justice for more people than at any other time in human history. The work of this committee is to remind Americans of that fact. If we get that right, nothing China can do will be able to stop us. And if we get that wrong, God help us. Thank you again for coming. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you, and the meeting of this committee is today adjourned.